everybody for coming. This is the WordPress acceptance testing solved talk. Before I get started, my name is Taylor Lovett. I am the VP of engineering for a company called 10up. We're one of the biggest WordPress focused agencies in the world. We build WordPress websites for major brands like ESPN and Google and Facebook, and we get to do a lot of really cool things with WordPress, solve a lot of really large problems. I am pretty involved in the WordPress open source community. I'm a core contributor. I've built a couple popular plugins. So that's a little bit of background information about me. So let's jump into WordPress acceptance testing. So what is the purpose of automated testing? Let me make sure I don't block the slides. So testing in general, it helps us reduce bugs, helps us reduce regressions. Generally, the purpose is we want our application to meet a set of requirements. Manual testing is very important, but it is also slow, it's expensive, it's prone to human error. Not to say it's still an important part of any application release process, but that is true. Automated testing, it can be integrated with like a CI pipeline, a delivery pipeline, so it can obviously be run automated as a part of your development and deployment process. So let's talk about the different types of automated testing, and this is just to name a couple. I mean, there's unit testing, there's functional testing, integration testing, acceptance / end-to-end testing, which I think are pretty much the same thing. There's visual regression testing. There's so many different types of testing. When you're getting into it, it can be confusing as to what is what and what do I actually need to do, what's going to have value for the application that I'm building. WordPress core, so the core software, it bundles integration tests, which they call unit tests, but are actually integration tests. And it also bundles end-to-end testing for certain features. The Gutenberg project, which is just released, is bundled with end-to-end testing. So what does the existing tooling landscape for WordPress look like? Well, the WordPress PHP unit test suite, which is again used for running integration tests, it is built off of PHP unit. You can also use the WordPress PHP unit test suite in your own plugins and themes to create integration tests, which is very useful. There's the WP mock project. That's a project started by 10up, my company. WP mock lets you mock WordPress functions, classes, methods, actions, hooks, all that stuff, so you can actually do true unit testing in WordPress if that is something that you're looking to do. There are a number of acceptance testing frameworks. Codeception, I'm going to talk about a little bit. That's like a popular PHP acceptance testing framework. There's a lot of custom ones. Gutenberg's end-to-end test suite is really just a custom thing built off of Puppeteer. And then there's like a million different JavaScript testing frameworks, which I'm not going to really talk about. So what is acceptance testing? So my definition of acceptance testing is testing that an application behaves as expected, and I'm going to modify that a bit, behaves as expected to the end user. In the web application world, this really means a user is interacting with a browser, interacting with your application via browser, and it is doing what the user expects, what it is supposed to do. So whereas unit integration testing, we're testing a specific piece of code in the application, acceptance testing, we're actually testing what the user sees. Okay, so this presentation is about open source, free acceptance testing framework. I'm just going to show you a little bit of a video of how that acceptance testing framework works. Let's see if I can get this to run. Okay, so the acceptance testing, WP acceptance, it's run in the command line. I don't know if that's super legible. I think it is. So we're starting the command. The first thing WP acceptance does is it spins up, it's all Docker based, it spins up like some Docker containers to run the actual acceptance tests. So then it creates your WordPress environment so it can run those tests on your environment. This will be relatively quick. I think the videos can be slow, but it's better than a live demo that breaks. Okay, so the testing is started. For each test, it actually spins up a browser, and you can watch as the test interacts with your application. So the test is actually logging into your website. That first test was just, can a user log in properly to your website? And that was successful. So this second test, it's logging into the website. It's now looking at the plugins page. This particular test suite is testing a 10-up plugin, which we add like suggested plugins to the plugins tab. So it's making sure that text exists and the user is seeing that in the admin. So, oops. Wait a minute. I want to fast forward. So as the tests go along, you can see in the console sort of the tests as they happen. The first one is a menu test. I can see the 10-up logo in the admin bar. The second one is the plugins test. I can see the 10-up suggested plugins. So each test is actually opening up a real live Chrome browser and interacting in that browser with your web application and showing you as each test goes what was successful and what wasn't. Okay, so what is the problem that WP acceptance is solving? Acceptance testing can be very challenging because everyone and every system, like every CI pipeline running the tests, must be running the same database on the same environment with the same code. If my colleague and I have different databases that we're running the acceptance tests against, we could very much get different results. The test might work for me and not work for him because he has a different database. So how do you solve that problem? Or maybe my colleague is running different version of PHP in a different, operating system or something like that. So now there's differences between our environments. How do we solve for that? So Codeception, I mentioned before, it's a popular PHP framework for writing acceptance tests. Works very well for what it does. The framework is totally environment and database agnostic. It doesn't bundle any functionality around database or environments. So again, I can write these really amazing Codeception acceptance tests for my application, but it makes no assumptions about the database or the environment. So now we get in a situation where we have this database dump for the acceptance test that we now have to pass around to our different colleagues and make sure everybody, are you running the acceptance test against the correct database? And again, you run into that environment problem where it's, okay, now we have to make sure, is your local environment set up like my local environment because your tests are coming up with different results? That is really where it gets to be difficult. And then for your CI pipeline, it's like, okay, well now I want my CI pipeline to run these acceptance tests, but how am I going to have a web environment that my CI pipeline is testing against? how do we make sure the CI pipeline has the same database that all the engineers have? And those are like the problems that we've run into that we weren't able to find a solution to with Codeception. So WP Acceptance, it's a toolkit. It empowers developers and CI pipelines to test code bases where the acceptance tests are version controlled and the environments are shareable. And I have a GitHub link. Of course, slides will be shared and everything like that. So what makes acceptance testing powerful? What makes WP Acceptance powerful? WP Acceptance lets you create environment instructions that you can version control with your code base. So every time you or your team member or your CI pipeline run those tests, an environment can be automatically generated based on that set of instructions. So since everybody has the same set of instructions, everybody has the exact same environment. And then WP Acceptance also runs all this in a standard development environment. So whether you run it locally, whether you run it in a CI pipeline, WP Acceptance is always running the same environment. So here is what those environment instructions look like. This is just an example. So the instructions are intended to be sort of like human readable lines. So the first one, install WordPress where the version is latest and URL is url.test. Activate plugin where name is Safe Redirect Manager. Install theme where name is 2019. Create a post, et cetera, et cetera. You can kind of understand like the theme of how these environment instructions work. At the bottom, I have a link to the GitHub that shows you all the supported instructions that you can use for this. So this works very well as long as your environment's not too complicated. If your environment I have a couple plugins, a theme, using environment instructions is great. For more complex solutions, I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes, how you handle that. So again, WP Acceptance, every time you run your test suite, it's going to run through these instructions and create an environment predictably using everything here. Okay, so WP Acceptance.json. Every project that uses WP Acceptance, you have to have a WP Acceptance.json. Typically, you'll put that in the root of your project, wherever that might be. So here's an example of that file. First thing it does is it gives a name for your project. This is 10up Experience. Again, that's a plugin that we have that just makes a couple modifications to your website to make it sort of in line with a couple of our best practices and gives you a couple useful things. There's this exclude property. So when you're running WP Acceptance, it's basically taking your entire code base and putting it into a Docker container. You don't want it to bring like your node modules. You might not want it to bring your vendor directories. That's just going to make everything slow. So you can exclude certain files and directories that you don't want to come with it. The test property, this tells WP Acceptance where your tests are. So in this case, we have this tests WPA directory, and then star.php is just run anything with a .php extension. That's where my tests live. The next property, enforce clean database. So when you're running acceptance tests with the framework, you can tell it that after each test you want a clean database. So this is useful for many reasons, because if you don't have a clean database, then each test is potentially modifying your database as it interacts with your web application, creating content, doing whatever. The disadvantage to enforcing a clean database is it is going to make your tests slower to run, because after each test it then has to like re-import all this SQL, and it just takes longer. Project path, that tells WP Acceptance where your project should essentially be mounted inside of the Docker container that it's executing inside of. And then environment instructions, this is what I showed you before, so you can basically provide it an array of instructions. wpacceptance.json, it will be version controlled just like your composer.json or package.json or whatever. So as your colleagues add and remove instructions, everybody will have that same set of instructions. All right, so snapshots, I alluded to this a little bit before. Environment instructions are great, they're very simple, but what if your environment is complicated? What if there's a huge database of sort of legacy data? There's tons of options set, there's menus, there's 30 different plugins, thousands of pieces of content. How do you handle that sort of environment? For this, we have what we call snapshot support, and this is based off of the WP Snapshots project, which is another 10-up project. So I have a link at the bottom. Snapshots are great for client work. So typically our open source projects, when we're acceptance testing those, we're going to use environment instructions because the environment's very simple. Set up WordPress, install the plugin, activate a theme. That's about all you need. Maybe create a few posts or something. But for our clients, I mean, they might have like a 2 gigabyte database of random stuff, and we want to make sure we're running our acceptance test suite against something as close to production as possible, so that, you know, we know when we're going to break production before we actually break production. So the snapshot workflow, WP Acceptance is going to run your tests against what we call a primary snapshot. The entire development team will be running against that primary snapshot. Each snapshot has an ID that is stored in your wpacceptance.json. I'm going to show you that in a minute. Every time you're running WP Acceptance, you can run it against your local environment and then essentially create a snapshot from your local environment. So after a snapshot is created from your local environment, your team members can then run the same test suite against that snapshot. So that's a handy way for you to create a snapshot. When you save a snapshot, it will update your wpacceptance.json, and then you can, commit that to your repository, push that upstream, and then your development team will then see, okay, we have a new snapshot that we're now testing off of. Typically, we will create a new snapshot when a new content type or something is added to the website, major changes are made to the website. That is typically when we think it's appropriate to add a new snapshot. So before I continue, so the way snapshots works is it can be a little tricky, but the snapshots project is based off of AWS S3. So you install the snapshot software, and it basically, every time you create a snapshot, it pushes it upstream to S3 and saves your files and your database on S3 and associates that with a snapshot ID. So then your team members, it can search through that library of snapshots and pull down snapshots into their environment as they see fit. WP Acceptance does this automatically. But in order for the snapshots workflow to work, you have to pass it AWS credentials. You have to store those, obviously, on AWS. Your team members have to have AWS credentials, and you have to, of course, set up like some sort of permissioning because you probably don't want the snapshots to be publicly viewable. So there is a little bit of setup involved, but it pays off in dividends when you're working with a team of developers. So this is what your wpacceptance.json file would look like with snapshots. So most everything is the same, but now we have this snapshots property. There's one snapshot in it. There's a name for the snapshot and ID. That ID again references the snapshot in S3. At the bottom, we have this repository property, so that tells snapshots this is the 10up AWS repository. That's important. For snapshots, you can provide it multiple snapshots. So maybe you want to run your tests against multiple snapshots. Each has like a different version of WordPress, different, I don't know, plugins or something. That is entirely possible. Also, something of note in this example file, we have this bootstrap property. So you can have like a bootstrap file similar to like a PHP unit type of thing that is run at the start of your test suite. This is for our open source plugin distributor where we use WP Acceptance. So installation and usage, WP Acceptance, it can be added to your project via Composer. You can use it on a theme. You can use it on a plugin. You can use it on an entire WordPress installation, pretty much however you see fit. We're typically version controlling the root of WP content and then adding WP acceptance.json to the WP content directory. That workflow is typically what we're doing, but depends on the situation, depends on the client. If it's an open source plugin, we're obviously adding WP acceptance.json to the root of the plugin directory. So it just depends on what works for you. WP acceptance, again, it's run via the command line. It has this init command, so you can run WP acceptance init, which is similar to like a Composer, I think Composer init or npm init or something that will take you through a step-by-step process of creating WP acceptance.json. And then when you run WP acceptance, it's simply just WP acceptance run. Obviously, there's a ton of flags, but that is the basic usage. So here's a simple test. First thing we're doing, we have this I variable, and it opens a browser page. So you can sort of pretend I as like a user. Then I calls this move to method, and it moves to the root of your web application. Then I is clicking on a.modal link, just a standard CSS selector, so it's clicking on some modal link. And then I is calling the ctext method, which is really just an assertion. And it is asserting that it sees the text. The text is actually visible in the browser modal title. So if modal title is not visible after clicking that link, the test would fail. WP acceptance on the testing side extends PHP unit. So it is behind the scenes using just like your standard PHP unit assertions that you could also use those as well if you wanted to assert things. But that's kind of like the basics of how your tests look. So here's another test. This time we're testing in the WordPress admin. So again, we have this I variable. The first thing it's doing is opening a browser page, and then we're calling login. So pretty self-explanatory. This is logging into the WordPress admin. Notice we're not providing like any admin username or password. That method does take those as optional parameters. You don't need to provide them because it automatically knows an admin user and password to log in to. So that's convenient. After we log in, we're moving to wp-admin/profile.php. So that's like the view that lets users manage their profile. After we move to a page, we typically call some sort of a wait function. If anybody's ever done anything with like Puppeteer or Codeception or anything, typically after you do something, you need to wait to make sure that the browser is finished loading or finished doing whatever. So we're waiting until an element is visible. And that's the WordPress admin bar CSS selector. Next, I is calling fill field. So we're filling an input field, the first name field, and we're putting in a test name. Then we are clicking submit. So that is clicking the save button on the profile and is saving the information that we've put in. Again, we're calling this wait function. We need to wait until the browser finishes loading. And then once the browser finishes loading, after we've clicked the save button, we're now making an assertion, PHP unit style, essentially, that we see a value in the attribute of that first name field. Pretty simple test. Pretty useful to test that your profile has been saved. I mentioned Codeception and Puppeteer. WP acceptance in the background does work off of Puppeteer. So these methods are essentially routing calls to Puppeteer. So here's another example. In this one, we are saving a post. So again, we are opening a browser page. We're logging in as the user admin. I'm navigating to WP admin to this post new.php page. Essentially, this is a custom post type redirect rule, and we're navigating to the creator for that custom post type so we can create a new redirect rule. We are calling fill field, and we're filling a couple inputs with /test/test2. There's like this notes field in this custom post type, so we're filling that with that notes text. And then we are clicking the publish button at the end. After we click the publish button, we need to wait until the browser reloads. And we're waiting for this updated CSS selector. After that happens, we're asserting through the cValue and property method that each of these fields we've changed contains the value that we have inputted. So this is essentially testing this is from our plugin Safe Redirect Manager, which lets you create redirects, that when we actually make changes to a redirect and fill in the values, that when the user clicks save, those values are reflected and are actually saved in the database and displaying properly on page reload. So extremely important. Again, this stuff like this is run as part of a CI pipeline. So every time a developer creates a pull request or something like that, these tests are run to make sure that like the basic application functionality is still working, that users can actually create redirects, which is fundamental to the plugin. So WP Acceptance has something called the standard test suite, which I think is really cool. This is basically just like standard tests that you can include in your application, mostly associated with WordPress. So as we build plugins and themes, we want to make sure that our plugins/themes aren't breaking core WordPress functionality. And if you've built a lot of WordPress plugins, you're interacting a lot with hooks and different WordPress internals. It's easy to do something wrong and accidentally break like a section of WordPress, or maybe break the admin or something like that. Even maybe you white screened WordPress. So the standard test suite lets you assert that those WordPress core internals are still working with your plugin. So here are just some examples of what you can do with the standard test suite. I can test and make sure that the front end is loading properly. I can test and make sure an admin can create a post successfully, testing that the admin bar is showing. One of the tests I showed you before, I can test that a user can actually update their profile and that that update works. I can test that a user can update general settings, etc. There's some more standard tests. Again, just things that you want to make sure work and are still compatible with your plugin or application. So in order to use the standard tests, you would simply write a WP acceptance test suite, create a method in your test class that calls one of the standard tests. So this one tests to make sure logging in works. So all we have to do in our test is just call that parent _ test login function and it'll run the test. So the standard test suite, it gives you a lot of things that you can just add to your application out of the box. You don't actually have to write any tests that are going to have some value and make your application a little more stable. As I've said, WP acceptance works great with continuous integration. We use it with Travis. We use it with GitLab a lot. There's actually some internals inside of the code of WP acceptance that makes it work well with GitLab. Here's an example Travis CI file. So very simple. We're just running composer install. We're making sure that Docker is running because WP acceptance runs on Docker. And then we're calling WP acceptance run in Travis. So very simple. WP acceptance, it comes with a ton of tools for debugging. This is super important because if you've ever written any acceptance tests with like Puppeteer or Selenium or Codeception, when your test has a problem, it can be hard to debug. So WP acceptance gives you a couple tools. One, there's like a verbose flag that you can add, so it'll show you a lot of debug information as it runs through your tests. Probably the most important thing is this show browser flag. So when I pass that show browser parameter to the command, it's going to pop up the browser and show it as it interacts and runs your code. That was like the video I showed you. You can also tell WP acceptance to slow down. So if things are happening too fast, you can tell it to slow down and kind of watch as it interacts with your application. So we have a ton of examples if you want to see WP acceptance in action, or you can pull code from these projects and kind of add it to your own applications. Some GitHub links. Again, slides will be available. There is a ton of documentation on WP acceptance, as well as like some cookbook code that you can pull into your projects. Link is there. And that is it. My contact information is there. If anybody has any questions or wants to contribute to the project, feel free to contact me. Also, our company 10up, shameless plug, we are hiring. We're a distributed company. We have some German presence. That's all. Thank you.